Small and midwestern, which in the eyes of many is synonymous for all that is hideous and cramping. A handful of people, they say we are, knotted together like roots in the darkness. Blind souls, they call us, struggling spirits who can never find deliverance from sordid surroundings. Poor thinkers, not to know that from tangled roots shimmering growth may spring to the light in beautiful winged release.
I don't know. I'm just letting them share my hobby. I mean, I'm sharing my hobby with them. I'm not...
What's your hobby?
Cutting up old newspapers. Genealogy. No, I don't know what it is. New Hartford history. New Hartford history. And New Hartford history says that there's a lot of people that lived here that were interesting, and I guess I'm trying to cover that.
Vopal, tell your story. Vopal's got a story to tell you.
Well, we got...
What about all the Best Streeter Aldrich stuff and that young lads like this could learn from that you've preserved and made accessible?
Well, my people just got to work when they got here. They didn't write. But then I got to reading Best Streeter Aldrich, and her stories were similar to what I think mine would have been. This is Best Streeter Aldrich, and this is school. No, town and school. And then this is people history.
I'm Vopal Youngberg from New Hartford, Iowa. I was born on a farm on a hot day in July many years ago, but I've lived within just a few miles of my birthplace all the rest of my life. Grandma Whitford was 74 years old and didn't want to stay in Connecticut alone, and so she came by covered wagon to Iowa with her family, and they settled in New Hartford. They bought a little house, a lot. New Hartford was just a bare piece of ground. Mr. Ensign said this square shall always be a town square. Then after he and Mrs. Wright were married, he just sort of sat back and let the town do what it wanted to, and about that time a Mr. Lashbrook came and bought west where the town is now.
Sidewalk bends where your house ends, like the neighborhood is on its knees, surrounded by a chain link fence, keeps me out but lets me see. Well, I come by most every night, shutters.
This man had a store in the back of his house. Averill told that her grandmother lived across the park, and she went over to the store, and everybody had a cow to produce their milk. And her grandmother went into the store, and the cow followed her in, and the store wasn't big enough for the cow to turn around, and cows do not back up. I feel so sorry for kids that live on the 16th floor of some apartment house and never even get their toes in the dirt. Everybody should have to step in a cow pie once in a while. And they should go through the cow pie out to the shooting stars. The kids should, every kid should have dirt between his toes.
Pink, but then try one green. Let me see.
Once at least, and he should get dirt between his toes going out to see the shooting stars, or to the woods to see the anemones. I think that that gets them nearer my God, get them nearer to my God, to know
Very first
this
school in
world that
this
God
county
created.
was just right over there a little ways. Just a little log cabin.
What?
The first school was a little log cabin right over there in the woods.
Do we have any other
day long legs are
spiders capable of killing
poisonous spiders in the world, but their teeth are too small to bite humans.
Oh, I'm glad to know that. I'm glad you added that. So let's go east just a little ways. I want to go to that next big tree.
Did God create the 14-story buildings? I don't know, but they should know the beauty of some of this stuff. I'd like to return the shooting stars to that wetland because that was a thing of so much beauty, and every child should know about them. And how will they know about them if we don't get them there, get the shooting stars back? Well, that's the end of my speech.
It would turn brown, and then we'd peel it off, and then that was our coffee in our playhouse. Oh, that's bad. They sent to France for the stone, and I can't tell you any more about it, but it was a very special stone. Then when they quit using it, one of the ensigns lived between here and the corner, and they took the stone home and put it for a stepping stone into their house. Well, your Aunt Margaret was living there, and the house burned. And they just walked away, and Carl Perrin knew that the stone was there and knew that it was important history, so he took it home and buried it and didn't tell anyone for a long time. Well, then he was working at our place and he told me he had it buried. Then they were having a Iowa history class, and I told them the story, and Mrs. Gersma went up and talked to Harold, or to Mr. Perrin, and he told them that he would help them dig it up and polish it up if they would find a place to put it, and that's where they found to put it. It's Geyer now, but that's where the black lady was buried first. Potter's Field is right down there in those trees. They were poor, they couldn't afford a plot, and they couldn't afford a marker. Well, and that schoolhouse stood there on the corner. There isn't any of what I went to school here anymore.
Yeah, just the same place.
Yeah. How do these buildings, well, they couldn't go together, but do they go together?
They're all little red bricks like that, and they look kind of nice, actually. They took down the high school I went to, too. Just the gym is there.
Well, the first water tank was up here. You could remember that, though. And this was where the first creamery was. And it was a very nice creamery.
My Grandma Garner a person of the Gospel Hall?
No, she
No,
was just
she
a
was
very, she was what my dad would call a hard-shelled Baptist. Well, they thought that the old church was falling apart. Before the funeral home, there was a theater in that building. One of the first telephone offices was in rooms up above the store. And here where the fire department is, there was a livery stable. It's the people that were driving the horse bus to school in the morning and then stayed at the livery stable until time to go back with the kids.
Some time ago, there's plenty for harvest, then the cold wind blows.
If you came into town, but with the horses, you left them at the livery stable and went up to the depot and rode into Cedar Falls and to shop. And at 4 o'clock you came home and picked up your horses and went home. There and said hi to everybody that walked by. Then there was a hotel on this lot here, and that's where Nell Griffith held her skirts so high, on the fence back of that. Where the library is, Goods had a popcorn stand. Mr. Good worked in the elevator and was a good worker in our church, and he had 6 daughters and a son. And he didn't want his daughters running around, so he bought a popcorn stand and put it there in the corner, because every Wednesday night they had free shows and Saturday night they had band concerts. And then the kids ran up and down the street. And he didn't want his kids running up and down the street, so he bought them a popcorn stand and made them work in the popcorn stand. And that's where the first bank was. Goodness, they've painted that without asking me. Oh, that used to be Ole Clote's. Yeah, the library, and before that it was Ole Clote's harness shop. Well, this is where the first elevator was. And it's burned 2 or 3 times, but this has always been elevator territory. After the Civil War, the railroad went through New Hartford, and then they could have their wheat and their flour shipped in cheaper than they could, and better than what they could grind on their own mill here. And the depot was right where that building is. The depot's been gone a long time.
Won't nobody take my business? I'll teach you how to come.
This building here was where the mortician was, and he sold furniture. John Johnson used to go and stay over to Mrs. Ramsey's if he got home and his mother wasn't home. And Mr. Ramsey always came home for tea at 3 o'clock. And one day after he had gone back to work, Don said, "What does Mr. Ramsey do?" Well, he sells furniture. And Don said, "What does he have upstairs?" And Mrs. Ramsey, and that's where he kept the caskets. But Mrs. Ramsey said, "We don't talk about that." Beaver Grove is the township to the very southeast corner of Butler County. Some of the territory is so hilly that
a living couldn't be made on it, and a lot of poor people lived in there in the early part of the century.
All summer long there were so many lovely things to do that one did not know how to find time for them all. There were flowers in the deep, dark recesses of the big woods, wild honeysuckles and bouncing bets and tall ferns that one could pretend were long, sweeping white plumes.
Oh, I'm just remembering. Right down there was the only place that you could find, those white flowers. And over there was the only place that you could find anemones, and over there was the only place, way over there was the only place you could find lacy fern. I'm just remembering. The good girls used to come out and we just walked around and enjoyed everything we saw. Spider webs in the sunshine and moisture on the spider webs like spun silver, just stuff. Many years ago it was used for firewood, and this was divided into lots, and each farmer had an acre or 2 or 3. Each time a man retired and moved to town, my dad would buy his little area of woods. And when I was at Downey and taking in $85 a month, my dad wrote and said, "Will Harmon's is for sale and I want to buy it. Send me $75. So I sent him my month's wages and he bought this little area right here. I don't want it cleaned up and mowed. I want some of it, you know, with this underground just like this. My dad was 14 or 15 years old. They were having a problem with thieves. They called them thieves. They were just horse rustlers, I guess. They would take them west and sell them. But in the meantime, they would hide them in a cave. And the cave was off across the mile. But some of the farmers got together and were going to find the horses and get them back. And my dad heard them telling about it. So he and his friend Louis came up and were going to just walk behind. And one of the farmers saw these kids following and just said, "Get." But then the story spread that there were horse thieves that hid their horses in a cave, and so then several of the people that lived here in the woods was sure that they had a cave that answered the description. And he knew all the trees, and I don't know where he learned that. You know, I mean, he knew all the trees, and that's where I learned my trees. There were several bushes that had real pretty blossoms and seed pods, and he'd bring those home to show us. When I was big enough to tag along, then he was interested in the Indians, and then we went to the woods on the other farm that he rented, and he thought he found a burial ground, that the Indians probably camped there. They were Plains Indians,